Lesson 5.6, Real Numbers. Real numbers consist of natural numbers, whole numbers, integers, rational numbers, and irrational numbers. Remember, if you look at the Venn diagram, their circles are inside of each other because they're contained in that group of numbers. So N stands for natural numbers, W is whole numbers, Z is integers, and Q is rational numbers. So now let's place some numbers or some samples in each of the boxes. So the square root of 7 is an irrational number because we cannot find the square root of 7. The square root of 9 is a rational number because we can find the square root of 9. It's a perfect square. 0 is a whole number. It is the only whole number that will appear in that circle in a Venn diagram because all other whole numbers are natural numbers, such as 2. -4 is an integer. 2/3 is a rational number. 8.6 repeating is a rational number. 12/100ths is a rational number. Pi is irrational. And 4.1356 with an ellipsis is an irrational number because it's non-terminating and non-repeating. Okay, your properties of addition are commutative, associative, identity, and inverse. Basically, the commutative property tells you can change the order, so it doesn't matter which one comes first. So 1 plus 2 is the same as 2 plus 1. The associative property is telling you that you can change the group of numbers. Identity property is telling you that if you add 0 to a number, you start with the original number. And the inverse property says if we add opposites, we end up with a sum of 0. Properties of multiplication are the commutative, associative, identity, zero, and inverse properties. The new property that we have listed here is the inverse property, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so commutative property changes the order of the numbers. The associative property changes the group of the numbers. The identity property says that if you multiply by 1, you end up with the same number. The zero property says if you multiply by 0, you end up with a 0. Now the inverse property is telling you if you take a number and multiply it by its reciprocal, you end up with 1. So for example, if I take 3 and I multiply it by 1/3, because the reciprocal of 3 is flipping over the number 3. If I multiply them together, you end up with 3 over 3, which is the same as 1. So it is an inverse. So a reciprocal would cancel out the other number. So for example, two non-zero numbers are reciprocals or multiplicative inverses of one another if their product is 1. So it's any time you're multiplying, if you take two numbers and multiply them and their product comes out to 1, you have a reciprocal or an inverse. Now, here are 6 examples. I would like you to name the property that is illustrated. Please be sure to copy down the example on your into your notes as well. So pause the video while you attempt to answer the questions. Okay, so number 1 is the commutative property of addition. It's commutative because the numbers are in a different order. On the first side, it says 3 plus 5. On the second side, it says 5 plus 3. The second property is the identity property of multiplication because we are multiplying by 1. The third property is the additive inverse because we added opposites to get 0. Number 4 is the zero property of multiplication because any number times 0 gives you 0. Number 5 is the associative property of addition because the grouping is different. And number 6, it looks tricky, is the inverse property of multiplication. Now, some of you are probably wondering, how in the world is that the inverse property of multiplication? Well, let's change them both to fractions, and then you'll have a better idea. If we take 2 and 5/10 and we make it into a fraction, you do 2 times 10 plus 5 gives you 25 over 10. And then if we simplify this fraction by dividing by 5, you end up with 5 over 2. If you take 4/10 and make that into a fraction, it's 4 over 10. If I simplify 4 over 10, I end up with 2/5. And now you can see that the two numbers are reciprocals. We have 5 over 2 and 2 over 5. That's why it's the inverse property of multiplication. Okay, write true or false for each of these statements. If false, please explain why. Pause the video for a moment and see if you can answer the questions. Okay, number 1 is false. There are other real numbers that are not natural numbers. For example, 2/3 is a real number, but it is not a natural number. The square root of 9 is a real number, but it is not a natural number. Every natural number is a whole number is true. Remember, all of your natural numbers are your counting numbers. So 1, 2, 3, etc. are all whole numbers. And last, if a number is irrational, then it is a real number, and that is true, because all of the real numbers are made up of rational as well as irrational numbers. So any irrational number is a real number. That concludes our video for today. Have a wonderful day.